Okay, class, I'm going to show you today how to get started writing an introductory paragraph. You've been in your journal, you've written a thesis statement, so we're going to talk about that. And then I'm just going to walk through and do a, think aloud about my process in terms of writing an introductory paragraph. You have a concept map, you have a checklist to work from that will help you, okay, in terms of getting organized, having a structure. Remember, it's a linear process, this kind of writing. Beginning, middle, end. Your introduction or your introductory paragraph is the first step, okay? So let's look at the thesis statement. You all have them in your journals, and I've written one that has 3 points based on my research, what I learned, okay, and the ideas I've chosen. Here's mine. I have chosen to pursue the career of a secondary English teacher. The tasks, education required, and salary are conducive to my needs and interests. So I've got 3 ideas. That's what I learned. That's what I've decided that I'm going to use to focus the rest of my paper, okay? So tasks, education required, salary. All right? So there's my thesis statement. I want that nearby, maybe to the right on a note card, maybe you have it on your concept map, somewhere while I'm drafting, so I keep focused on what my ideas are, because those give me my structure. All right, I'm going to look at this thing. Where do I start? I want to get the reader's attention, so I write what's called a hook. Okay, what's a hook? It can be an anecdote, which is like a little story. It can be a question. It could be a quote. All right, so I'm thinking about that, what my process was, and why I even started. This is, I knew kind of what I wanted to research. I'm like, oh, I have a story from my childhood. That's what I'm going to use for my anecdote. Okay, so here it is. I have my thesis up there. Here's my little hook. As far back as I can remember, I wanted to teach. When I was 8 years old, I would line up my stuffed animals and give them lessons on how to spell. It was my favorite pastime. So I've done a couple things there. I've told the reader something personal about myself, and I've introduced the topic so they kind of know where I'm going, okay? So why don't you all practice that? Take 5 minutes and just think a little bit. Anecdote, question, or quote. All right? I'll give you 5 minutes. Here you go. Okay, next step. We go back to our checklist, right? I see here I need a transitional word. I have this list of transitional words right here, so I'm going to use that. I don't need to try to go back into my hard drive of my brain. And I'm going to use a transitional word, and then my next step, if I look ahead, I have to write a sentence that describes some aspect of my research, what that process was like, okay? So, transitional word, I'm going to worry about that later and just think about the research. I did an interview, I looked at some databases, I had a book or two, but what was really interesting to me was that interview. So I'm going to write something about that, okay? Once I get that figured out, then I'll provide a transition. So I'm thinking about that interview and what I learned. Here I go. After researching this career, which included an interview with a secondary English teacher, an online interest inventory, you've all done those as well, and research on 2 databases, I've determined that the career of an English teacher suits me well. So you notice I do have a transitional word in there. The very beginning, right after. It's right up there. Because that's really kind of how it was for me in terms of my process. I've introduced the idea of my research. I've told the reader what I did, okay? And finally, I have this little statement at the end. I have determined that the career of an English teacher suits me well. There's different ways you can say that. It's another way I'm kind of backing up and leading into my thesis, right? So don't worry too much about that. Just write something about that research process, okay? Could be a question that you still have even. Why don't you take 5 minutes and practice that, and I'll come around. All right, so we look at our checklist. We're almost halfway in, right? I've gotten through 3 of those little boxes. The next thing I'm going to do is write a compound or complex sentence that has 2 ideas for my thesis. So remember, up here, here's my thesis again. Okay, 2 ideas. I've got this going on. I've got tasks. task education salary? Well, for me, what I'm concerned about the most, or what interests me the most, are the tasks and the education. So I have a compound complex sentence. That's one of those big ones. Remember, 2 independent clauses. So this may be a little work. I'm going to have to think a little bit, but I'll try drafting a few things. I'm going to write about what I learned about the tasks and education, but not in too much detail, right? Because it's just an introduction. Okay, here I go. All right. Teachers must be organized. Oops, went backwards. We don't want to do that. Hold on, you're getting a peek. All right, teachers must be organized, yet creative. They must be able to form relationships with their students, and they must know the content well and be able to relay this to their students. All right, so tasks are up here, right? You see that? You have to be organized. That's part of the things you have to do. You have to be able to converse with your students, have relationships. And finally, I do get into the education, or I allude to it. You have to know the content, right? So, compound complex sentence, right? Because I've got 2 phrases that can stand alone, and I've got 2 ideas in there. Now that's a little more challenging, so I'm going to give you a little more time than 5 minutes if you need it. Why don't you all try to practice that? Write your compound complex sentence with 2 of your ideas from your thesis. All right, here you go. Okay, it's going well so far. And look, you've almost done, because you know you have the thesis. I've got 2 ideas, so there's 1 left. All right, and that's, for me, the salary. So I'm going to write something about that. Let's see what I need to do. It says, write another sentence that contains your 3rd idea and leads to your thesis. Okay, I can do that, right? So, salary. I know I learned that it wasn't the best, you know, in terms of the salary. So I don't want to get into too much detail again. I need to say amounts and all of this stuff and the cost of living, but I want to make a statement about that. So here's what I got. Teacher salaries are not always substantial, but the most important thing to me is that I love my work. Okay? So I've let the reader know I'm probably going to be talking about how they're not great. Okay? There's going to be some details about that, but I haven't gotten into all the detail. So that's my 3rd point. All my ideas are in there. I've got the hook. I'm way down at the bottom of my checklist now. I'm almost done. If you're using the concept map, now you know if you look in terms of the fields on your concept map, you've got some of those things filled out. Maybe 1 more piece to write in there. I have a transitional word, another one of those, and then the thesis. I don't have to use a transitional word before the thesis statement. It's up to you, okay? I like to do that because I think it just helps it flow. So my last thing, again, is to put my thesis statement in there, and then the whole thing comes together. There's my thesis with the therefore, okay? And finally, there's my introductory paragraph, okay? As far back as I can remember, I wanted to teach. When I was 8 years old, I would line up my stuffed animals and give them lessons on how to spell. It was my favorite pastime. After researching this career, which included an interview with a high school English teacher, an online interest survey, inventory, and research on 2 databases, I have determined that the career of an English teacher suits me well. Teachers must be organized, get creative, they must be able to form relationships with their students, and they must know the content well and be able to relay this to their students. Teacher salaries are not always substantial, but the most important thing to me is that I love my work. Therefore, I have chosen to pursue the career of a secondary English teacher. The tasks, education required, and the salary are conducive to my needs and interests. Now, the vocabulary here, don't worry too much about word choice. You can always go back and find the right words. Conducive is kind of a fancy word in terms of like meeting or works well. So I can help you with that later. Transitional words, again, don't have to have that one, but it helps it to flow. So I'll give you guys some more time to do some drafting, and we'll go to the computer lab in a bit.